The air in the funeral home was heavy, thick with the scent of lilies and wax. Eleanor Grayson stood by the open casket, her trembling fingers tracing the edge of the polished mahogany. Her father, Harold, lay still, his face serene in a way it hadn't been in years. At 92, he'd fought a long battle with illness. And now, at last, he was at peace. Eleanor, 70, felt the weight of her years pressing against her chest, each breath a reminder of the void he'd left behind. She'd always been her father's shadow, his confidant through decades of quiet moments, shared cups of tea, late-night talks about life, and the stories he told of his youth. Harold had been a man of few words but profound love, the kind that didn't need grand gestures. He'd raised Eleanor alone after her mother passed when she was 9, stitching together a life of modest means with unwavering devotion. Now, standing here, she felt like that little girl again, lost without his steady hand. The room was nearly empty. A few distant cousins had come, offering brief condolences before slipping away. Her siblings Margaret, Paul, and Clara had been there earlier, their faces tight with obligation rather than grief. They'd stood at a distance, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting to their phones or the clock on the wall. Eleanor had noticed their impatience, the way they shifted their weight, eager to leave. She hadn't expected warmth from them. Their relationship had frayed long ago, tangled in petty jealousies and old wounds. But she hadn't expected this. As the service ended, the funeral director, a kind-eyed man named Mr. Thompson, approached her. "Mrs. Grayson, we're about to close up. Would you like a moment longer?" Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She lingered by the casket, whispering a final goodbye. "I'll make you proud, Dad," she said softly, her voice breaking. She didn't hear the door open or close, didn't notice the absence of footsteps. When she turned, the room was empty. Her siblings were gone. She stepped outside, expecting to see their cars idling in the lot, perhaps waiting to offer her a ride home. But the parking lot was deserted, save for a few scattered leaves skittering across the asphalt. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and a chill settled into her bones. They hadn't just left the service early. They'd left her behind. Eleanor stood there, clutching her purse, the white rose still in her hand. The funeral home was miles from her small apartment, and she had no car. Harold had been the one to drive her everywhere in his old Buick, even in his final years, insisting on it despite her protests. Now, she was stranded, abandoned by the only family she had left. She could have called a cab, but the thought felt hollow, like admitting defeat. Instead, she sat on a bench outside the funeral home, the rose wilting in her grip. Memories flooded her. Margaret's sharp tongue, always cutting at Eleanor's choices. Paul's indifference, treating her like an afterthought. Clara's endless demands, as if Harold's care had been Eleanor's burden alone. They'd always resented her closeness to their father, accusing her of monopolizing his affection. But they'd never understood the sacrifices she'd made, years of caregiving, sleepless nights, and quiet moments when she'd held his hand through the pain. As the sky darkened, Mr. Thompson emerged, concern etched on his face. "Mrs. Grayson, do you need a ride?" She shook her head, forcing a smile. "I'll manage. Thank you." He hesitated, then handed her a card. "If you need anything, call me. Your father was a good man. He spoke of you often." The words pierced her. She nodded, tucking the card into her purse, and began the long walk home. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of betrayal. Her siblings hadn't just left her at the funeral home, they'd left her to carry the grief alone. By the time she reached her apartment, the rose was crumbling, its petals falling to the floor. She placed it on the kitchen table, next to a framed photo of her and Harold, taken years ago at a county fair. He was laughing, his arm around her, the sunlight catching the warmth in his eyes. She stared at the photo, her resolve hardening. They could abandon her, but she wouldn't let them erase what she and her father had shared. The next morning, Eleanor found a letter in her mailbox, its envelope crisp and official. It was from her father's lawyer, Mr. Edward Langley. The will was to be read that afternoon. Her siblings had already called, their voices clipped, asking if she'd be there. She hadn't answered. Let them wonder, she thought. Let them feel the absence they'd created. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple black dress and her father's old watch, its ticking a steady reminder of his presence. As she stepped into the lawyer's office, she felt a flicker of something new, not just grief, but defiance. Harold had always believed in her strength, even when she doubted it herself. Today, she would honor that. The office was stark, all polished wood and leather chairs. Margaret, Paul, and Clara were already there, seated in a tight cluster, their faces a mix of anticipation and unease. They barely acknowledged her as she sat down, her hands folded in her lap. Mr. Langley, a wiry man with sharp eyes, cleared his throat and began. Harold Grayson's estate is modest but carefully allocated, he said, adjusting his glasses. He left specific instructions, and I'll read them as written. Eleanor's heart pounded. She hadn't thought much about the will. Her father's love had been his greatest gift. But as Mr. Langley spoke, she saw her siblings lean forward, their eyes glinting with greed. They expected a windfall, a tidy sum to split among themselves. They hadn't been there for the late nights, the hospital visits, the quiet moments when Harold's hand trembled in hers. They hadn't earned it. And then, Mr. Langley paused, his gaze settling on Eleanor. To my daughter Eleanor, he read, I leave the entirety of my estate, including the house, savings, and all personal belongings, in recognition of her unwavering devotion. The room went silent. Margaret's face twisted, Paul's jaw tightened, and Clara let out a sharp gasp. Eleanor felt their stares, but she kept her eyes on the lawyer, her heart racing. Harold had seen her, truly seen her, even in his final days. This was his way of saying it. You can't be serious. Margaret snapped, breaking the silence. She gets everything. Mr. Langley raised a hand. These are your father's wishes. There's more, if you'll allow me to continue. But Eleanor barely heard the rest. Her siblings' voices rose, a cacophony of indignation, but she felt a strange calm. They'd left her at the funeral home, discarded her like an afterthought. Now, they'd face the consequences of their absence. She wasn't vindictive, she'd never been that way, but she felt a quiet justice in her father's choice. As the meeting ended, her siblings stormed out, muttering about lawyers and appeals. Eleanor stayed behind, her fingers tracing the watch on her wrist. Mr. Langley approached, his expression kind but cautious. Your father left a letter for you, he said, handing her a sealed envelope. He asked that you read it alone. She nodded, her throat tight, and tucked the letter into her purse. That night, alone in her apartment, she opened it. Harold's handwriting was shaky but unmistakable, each word a piece of his heart. Eleanor, my light, it began. You were my strength when I had none. Don't let them dim you. The house, the money, it's yours. Not because I loved you more, but because you loved me when they wouldn't. Live well. My girl. Make me proud. Tears fell, blurring the ink. She clutched the letter, her resolve solidifying. They'd left her behind, but she wouldn't let their betrayal define her. She'd build a life from her father's gift, not just the inheritance, but the love he'd left her. And she'd do it her way. Eleanor woke to the sound of rain tapping against her window, a soft rhythm that mirrored the ache in her chest. The letter from her father lay on her nightstand, its edges already worn from rereading. She hadn't slept much, her mind caught between grief and the weight of her new reality. The house, her father's house. Now hers was more than just a building. It was a tapestry of memories, woven with moments she'd thought would last forever. She drove to the house that morning, the old Buick's engine coughing as she navigated the familiar streets. The neighborhood hadn't changed much in the decades since she'd grown up there. Modest bungalows, sagging porches, and gardens that bloomed despite neglect. Her father's house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its white paint peeling, the front yard overgrown with wildflowers. It wasn't grand, but it was homer it had been, until illness had forced Harold to move in with her. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of her father's pipe tobacco. Eleanor wandered through the rooms, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood. The living room held the old couch where she and Harold had watched black and white movies, laughing at the melodrama. The kitchen still had the chipped mug he'd used every morning. Upstairs, in his bedroom, she found his favorite sweater draped over a chair, as if he'd just stepped out. She sat on the edge of his bed, the sweater in her lap, and let the memories wash over her. This was where she'd read to him when he was too weak to hold a book, where she'd listened to his stories of the war, of love, of regrets. Her siblings had rarely visited, always too busy with their own lives. Margaret had her high-powered job, Paul his endless projects, Clara her socialite dreams. They'd called Harold's house outdated, a burden they'd rather sell than cherish. But to Eleanor, it was a sanctuary. Her phone buzzed, shattering the quiet. It was Margaret, her voice sharp through the line. Eleanor, we need to talk about the will. This isn't fair. Dad wasn't in his right mind. Eleanor's grip tightened on the sweater. He was clear enough to write me a letter, she said, her voice steady. He knew what he wanted. Margaret scoffed. You manipulated him. You were always there, whispering in his ear. I was there when he needed me. Eleanor shot back. Where were you? The line went silent, then clicked off. Eleanor exhaled, her hands trembling. She wasn't used to fighting back, but something in her had shifted. Her father's trust had given her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming. Paul, Clara, even their spouses, each one demanding a share of the estate. They accused her of greed, of stealing what was rightfully theirs. Clara's husband, Greg, showed up at the house one afternoon, his smile oily as he suggested they work something out. Eleanor sent him away, her voice firm despite the knot in her stomach. She began sorting through the house, boxing up her father's things. Each item told a story: the pocket watch he'd carried in the war, the photo album filled with faded pictures of her childhood, the handwritten recipes he'd scribbled on scraps of paper. She found a box of letters he'd written to her mother, never sent, filled with love and longing. Reading them felt like touching his heart again. But the house wasn't just a museum of memory as it was falling apart. The roof leaked, the pipes groaned, and the electrical wiring was a fire hazard. Eleanor knew it would take money to fix. Money she didn't have. Her father's savings were modest. Enough to live on, but not enough to restore the house to its former glory. Still, she couldn't bear the thought of selling it. Not yet. She called Mr. Langley, the lawyer, to discuss her options. He suggested hiring a contractor to assess the repairs and offered to connect her with a financial advisor. Your father wanted you to have a future, Eleanor, he said. Not just a house, but a life. His words stayed with her as she walked through the backyard, where Harold had once tended a small vegetable garden. The plants were gone, but the soil was still rich, waiting for new life. She knelt, pressing her hands into the earth, and made a decision. She'd keep the house, no matter the cost. It was her father's legacy, and hers too. But her siblings weren't done. One evening, as she locked up the house, she found a letter taped to the front door. It was from Paul, written in his hurried scrawl. We're contesting the will. It read, You can't keep everything. We'll see you in court. Eleanor's heart sank, but she didn't crumple. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her purse. If they wanted to fight, she'd give them one nod out of spite. But because she owed it to her father to protect what he'd entrusted to her, she drove back to her apartment, the Buick's headlights cutting through the dusk. In her mind, she saw her father's face, his gentle smile. Live well, my girl, he'd written. She would. But first, she'd face her siblings' greed head-on, armed with the love he'd left her and the strength she was only beginning to discover. The lawyer's office felt colder this time, the air sharp with tension. Eleanor sat across from Mr. Langley, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her siblings had made good on their threat. They'd filed a motion to contest the will, claiming Harold hadn't been of sound mind when he'd written it. The accusation stung, not just because it was a lie, but because it dismissed the clarity of his love for her. They're arguing undue influence, Mr. Langley explained, his voice calm but firm. They say you coerced your father into leaving you everything. Eleanor's jaw tightened. I was there for him. They weren't. If anything, they ignored him. Mr. Langley nodded, his eyes sympathetic. I believe you, Eleanor. And your father's letter strengthens your case. But this could get messy. Contesting a will is a long process, and they've hired a lawyer who's aggressive. She thought of her siblings' faces at the will, reading Margaret's sneer, Paul's cold stare, Clara's theatrical tears. They hadn't cared about Harold's wishes, only his money, the house, the savings. They saw them as prizes to be won, not a legacy to be honored. What do I need to do? She asked. Gather evidence, Mr. Langley said. Anything that shows your father's intent, letters, journals, even witnesses who saw your relationship with him. And be prepared for them to dig into your life. They'll try to paint you as manipulative. Eleanor felt a chill. Her life had been quiet, unassuming, decades of teaching, then caregiving for her father. She'd never married, never had children, her world revolving around her students and Harold. There was nothing to hide, but the thought of her siblings twisting her devotion into something ugly made her stomach churn. She spent the next week combing through the house, searching for anything that could support her case. She found a journal Harold had kept in his final year, its pages filled with shaky handwriting. One entry, dated a month before his death, brought tears to her eyes. Eleanor is my heart. She's here every day, reading to me, making me laugh. The others call, but it's not the same. I want her to have the house, she'll keep it alive. She photocopied the pages and sent them to Mr. Langley, along with letters from neighbors who'd seen her at Harold's side, day after day. But the work was exhausting, and the house's disrepair weighed on her. The contractor's estimate had come in, $50,000 to fix the roof, plumbing, and wiring. Her father's savings wouldn't cover it, and her own pension was modest. She began to wonder if keeping the house was a dream she couldn't afford. One afternoon, as she sorted through old photos, her phone rang. It was Clara, her voice saccharine. "Eleanor, let's settle this. We'll split the estate evenly. No need for court." Eleanor paused, the photo in her hand showing her and Harold planting tulips. Her smile wide and his eyes proud. "You left me at the funeral home," she said quietly. "You didn't even care enough to say goodbye to him." Clara's tone hardened. "You're being selfish. Dad would have wanted us to share. He wanted me to have it," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "You can fight me in court, but I'm not giving up." She hung up, her heart pounding. She wasn't just fighting for the house, she was fighting for her father's truth, for the love they'd shared. But doubt crept in. What if she lost? What if the house, the memories, were taken from her? That evening, she visited the local library, where she'd worked part-time after retiring from teaching. Her old colleague, Sarah, greeted her with a hug. "You look tired. Ellie, everything okay?" Eleanor hesitated, then told her everything: the funeral, the will, the lawsuit. Sarah listened, her face softening. "Your dad was so proud of you," she said. "He used to come in here, bragging about how you'd read him poetry at night. You don't deserve this." The words warmed her, but they also sharpened her resolve. She wasn't alone. There were people who'd seen her devotion, who'd known Harold's heart. She began reaching out to them: neighbors, old friends, even the nurse who'd cared for him in his final months. They agreed to write statements, to testify if needed. But the pressure was mounting. Margaret sent a letter, accusing Eleanor of hiding assets. Paul called, threatening to drag the case out for years. Clara spread rumors in their small community, painting Eleanor as a greedy daughter who'd manipulated a dying man. The whispers hurt, but Eleanor kept her head high, refusing to let their lies define her. One night, as she sat in the house, a storm raging outside, she found a small wooden box under Harold's bed. Inside was a locket, its gold tarnished but warm in her hand. She opened it to find a tiny photo of her as a child, smiling beside her mother. A note was tucked inside, in Harold's handwriting, for Eleanor. "My forever girl. Keep shining." She clutched the locket, tears streaming down her face. This was why she fought not for money, but for the love that had shaped her. She'd face her siblings in court, armed with her father's words and the truth of their bond. They could try to take the house, but they'd never take that. The courthouse was a gray monolith, its halls echoing with hurried footsteps and hushed voices. Eleanor sat on a hard wooden bench, her hands gripping the locket she'd found in her father's box. The hearing was today, the first step in a legal battle she hadn't wanted but couldn't avoid. Mr. Langley sat beside her, his briefcase open, papers neatly stacked. He'd warned her it would be tough. Her sibling's lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named M.S. Carver, was known for tearing apart witnesses. Across the room, Margaret, Paul, and Clara sat in a tight knot, their faces set in grim determination. They avoided Eleanor's gaze, their whispers like a low hum of accusation. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but the locket against her palm grounded her. Harold's note, "Keep shining," echoed in her mind. The judge, a stern woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun, called the room to order. M.S. Carver stood first, her voice smooth and cutting. "Your Honor, Harold Grayson was a frail, vulnerable man in his final years. Eleanor Grayson took advantage of his weakened state, isolating him from his other children to secure the estate for herself. Eleanor's chest tightened. She wanted to stand, to shout that it wasn't true. But Mr. Langley placed a hand on her arm, his eyes steady. Let them talk, he whispered. We'll have our turn. Ms. Carver presented letters from Margaret, Paul, and Clara, claiming they'd been pushed out by Eleanor's constant presence. They painted her as a schemer, a daughter who'd hovered over Harold to control his decisions. Eleanor listened, her heart pounding, as they twisted her years of caregiving into something sinister. When it was Mr. Langley's turn, he stood, his voice calm but firm. Eleanor Grayson was not her father's captor, she was his caregiver, his companion, his confidant. Harold Grayson's will was clear, written in his own hand, and supported by his journal and letters. He presented the evidence, Harold's journal, the letter he'd left her, statements from neighbors and the nurse. One by one, they painted a picture of a daughter who'd sacrificed her own life to care for her father, while her siblings drifted in and out, offering little more than complaints. Eleanor took the stand, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger. She spoke of the nights she'd stayed up with Harold, reading his favorite books, holding his hand through the pain. She described the house, its creaking floors and faded wallpaper, not as a prize, but as a home filled with love. They left me at the funeral home, she said, her eyes meeting the judge's. They didn't even wait to say goodbye to him. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words settling over the room. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Paul stared at the floor, and Clara dabbed at her eyes, though Eleanor saw no tears. Ms. Carver cross-examined her, her questions sharp. Did you ever discourage your siblings from visiting? Did you tell your father they didn't care? No, Eleanor said firmly. I begged them to come. They chose not to. The hearing stretched on, days turning into weeks. Witnesses came and went, neighbors who'd seen Eleanor's daily visits, the nurse who'd watched her tend to Harold's every need. Even Mr. Thompson, the funeral director, testified, his voice soft but clear. She was alone that day, he said. Her siblings left without a word. I offered her a ride, but she walked home in the dark. The judge listened, her face unreadable. Eleanor felt the strain of it all, the endless questions, the accusations, the weight of proving her love. But she held fast, drawing strength from the locket, from her father's words, from the truth she carried. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, she returned to the house. The roof had sprung a new leak, and water dripped into a bucket in the kitchen. She sat at the table, staring at the photo of her and Harold at the fair. The legal fees were mounting, eating into her savings. She wondered if she was fighting a losing battle, if the house was worth the pain. Then she found another letter, tucked inside a cookbook she'd overlooked. It was from Harold, written years ago, when she'd first started caring for him. Eleanor, you're stronger than you know. It read, this house is yours, not just because you love it, but because you'll make it mean something. Don't let go. She wept, but the tears were cleansing. She wasn't fighting for a building, she was fighting for her father's trust, for the life they'd built together. The next day, she returned to court with renewed determination, ready to face whatever came. The courtroom felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the judge prepared to deliver her ruling. Eleanor sat rigid, her hands clasped around the locket, its cool metal a tether to her father. Weeks of testimony had left her drained, but she'd held her ground, refusing to let her siblings' lies erase the truth. Mr. Langley sat beside her, his face calm but expectant. Across the aisle, Margaret, Paul, and Clara whispered among themselves, their confidence unshaken. The judge adjusted her glasses, her voice steady as she began. This case hinges on the intent of Harold Grayson and the validity of his will. After reviewing the evidence, his journal, letters, and witness testimonies, it is clear that Mr. Grayson was of sound mind when he designated Eleanor Grayson as his sole heir. Eleanor's breath caught. She felt Mr. Langley's hand on her shoulder, a quiet reassurance. The claims of undue influence are unsupported. The judge continued. Eleanor Grayson's devotion to her father was evident in her actions, corroborated by those who knew them. The will stands as written. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Margaret's face flushed red. Paul's hands clenched, and Clara let out a sharp sob, this time with real tears. Eleanor felt no triumph, only relief, a weight lifting, though the ache of her siblings' betrayal remained. The judge dismissed the case, and Eleanor stood, her legs unsteady. Mr. Langley guided her out, away from her siblings' glares. In the hallway, he handed her a folder. The estate is yours, Eleanor. The house, the savings, everything. What will you do now? She didn't answer right away. Her mind was still in the courtroom, replaying the judge's words. Her father's journal, the locket's weight in her hand. She thought of the house, its leaks and creaks, and the life she could build there. That evening, she returned to the house, the key turning smoothly in the lock. The air was still, the silence comforting. She walked through the rooms, seeing not just the past but the future. She could fix the roof, plant a new garden, make the house a home again. But it wasn't just about the house, it was about honoring her father's belief in her. She called a contractor the next day, using part of the savings to start repairs. The work was slow, but each fixed pipe, each patched wall, felt like a step toward healing. She began volunteering at the library again, teaching reading classes to children, sharing the stories her father had loved. The community rallied around her, their support a reminder that she wasn't alone. Her siblings didn't reach out, and she didn't expect them to. The rift was too deep, their choices too final. But she found peace in letting them go, in building a life that reflected her father's love rather than their resentment. One afternoon, as she tended the newly planted tulips in the backyard, Sarah stopped by with a gift, a small plaque engraved with Harold's words, "Keep shining." Eleanor hung it in the living room, above the couch where they'd watched those old movies. It felt right, a quiet tribute to the man who'd shaped her. She began writing, too, filling a journal with her own stories, memories of her father, lessons she'd learned, dreams for the future. The act was cathartic, a way to process the pain and find meaning in it. She wasn't just preserving the house. She was preserving herself. Spring arrived, painting the neighborhood in soft greens and golds. The house was transforming, its roof sturdy, its walls freshly painted. Eleanor stood in the backyard, her hands dusted with soil from planting a new vegetable garden. The tulips were blooming, their vibrant petals a nod to the past and a promise for the future. She'd made the house her own, filling it with small touches, books on the shelves, photos on the walls, a new kettle whistling in the kitchen. It wasn't just a home. It was a testament to her resilience, to the love that had carried her through grief and betrayal. The savings were enough to keep her comfortable, but she lived simply, finding joy in the ordinary. The community embraced her. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles. Children from her library classes drew pictures for her fridge. Sarah became a regular visitor, their evenings spent laughing over tea, just as Eleanor had with her father. She felt his presence in those moments, his pride a quiet warmth in her heart. One day, she received a letter, not from her siblings, but from Mr. Thompson, the funeral director. He'd heard about the court case and wanted to check on her. Tucked inside was a photo from the service. One she hadn't seen, her standing by Harold's casket. The white rose in her hand. Her face a mix of sorrow and strength. "You're stronger than you know," he wrote, echoing her father's words. Eleanor framed the photo, placing it beside the one from the fair. It wasn't about erasing the pain of that day, but reclaiming it. Her siblings had left her, but she'd found her own way forward. She didn't need their approval, only her father's love and her own. She began hosting small gatherings at the house book clubs, gardening workshops, even a poetry night where she read from Harold's favorite collections. The house came alive again, filled with voices and laughter. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the one she'd built, brick by brick, from the ashes of loss. As she stood in the garden one evening, the sun setting behind the tulips, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The locket hung around her neck, a constant reminder of her father's faith in her. She'd honored his wishes, not just by keeping the house, but by living well, by shining in her own quiet way. Her siblings' absence was a scar, but it no longer bled. She'd left them to their choices, to the lawyer who defended her father's truth. And in doing so, she'd found herself not just Harold's daughter, but Eleanor, a woman of strength, of love, of resilience. She looked at the house, its lights glowing in the dusk, and smiled. "I did it, Dad," she whispered. "I'm making you proud." And in the stillness, she felt his answer, a breeze through the tulips, a warmth in her heart, a legacy that would never fade.